identifying, quote, the lack of context and racist notions as particularly problematic. Their study echoed the earlier findings of Karim H. Karim, another media scholar, who traced the resilience of, according to him, quote, centuries-old primary stereotypes, particularly that of the Islamic peril and the violent Muslim, to be pervasive in the media. Karim noted that media discourses, quote, accord an implicit primacy to nation-states, particularly to elite nations such as the American superpower, making invisible what he called the wholesale violence of these nations while highlighting the violence of subnational groups. So, as many of us were witness, the CBC, along with CanWest Global National Network, played a major role in fear-mongering and mobilizing public support for US foreign policy and for bringing Canadian policy in line to that, laying the grounds for the shift to the political right that we're living through right now. It would not be unfair, therefore, to say that we're not actually cheerleading for the US administration. The Canadian media plays a pivotal role in legitimizing US-led imperialism in the form of the war on terror outside the borders of the US. This media mobilized the Canadian public in support of the war, thereby granting the US administration international legitimacy. In other words, the mainstream media helped legitimize the war on terror as a global war, and in the process helped to restabilize colonial and imperialist remakings of the West that had been deeply unsettled by anti-racist, indigenous, and anti-colonial movements in the post-World War II period. It is in the context of these media-heightened anxieties and paranoid fears regarding national and global insecurity that a long-standing media and popular hostility towards Islam in the West that we have experienced the escalation in the growth of the media democratization movement. But this alternate media movement was likewise flooded with Islamophobic perspectives and politics. Islamophobic documentaries and publications, including most particularly those made by Muslim women, were promoted and celebrated unquestioningly. These were promoted as telling the truth about Islam, as revealing the real beliefs and practices of Muslim communities. It was not insignificant that in the US, the Office of the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, at that time, provided massive amounts of funding for media projects for Afghan women to be trained to produce documentaries about their own experiences. I think it is very important to recognize this point. The media democracy movement certainly recognizes the critical need for challenging the corporatization of the media, defining this as a major obstacle to the practice of democratic governance. This movement is certainly also very actively engaged in practices that promote democratization of media and is committed to promoting perspectives from the social movements that seek to transform neoliberalism and its forms of governance. The politics of mainstream media ownership, characterized by this concentration and centralization of corporate media, is defined as a key feature of its undemocratic nature, its biased practices of knowledge production, its manipulation of news reporting and public opinion, and its basically unrepresentative and unaccountable role in society. These are all challenged by the media democratization movement, and I don't want to underscore the importance of this political challenge coming from the media democratization movement. The alternate media, thus, has developed in a way that makes it want to be more democratic, more inclusive, more connected to social justice movements, and to marginalized sectors of society, and quite rightly so. In many cases, it has succeeded in doing this. All of us here this evening are here because we see the democratization of media is absolutely vital to building our social justice movements, to create a space for raising alternate worldviews, to create space for dialogue and debate that is otherwise lacking in the public sphere. But my concerns arise, and my comments in the rest of my talk arise from that when alternate media is treated as self-transparently committed to fundamental and revolutionary social transformation, to representing the concerns of the most marginalized, to contesting the power of various elites in society, this is a major problem. This cannot be something that is taken for granted. Often there is also a self-congratulatory aspect to this media that is really difficult to sustain when one analyzes it seriously, as is the idea that media democratization and alternate media is always inherently representative of the politics of dissent and of radical contestation of ruling ideas and ruling ideologies. So this is not an impertinent question to ask. In what ways does the media democratization movement challenge the imperialist ideology that underpins the war on terror, that is remaking the Western-dominated global order? In what ways does it challenge the racialization of the global economy that has been foundational to the emergence of capitalism as a global system of relations? The questions, I think, which are critical for us to ask ourselves at this moment in history: what does media democracy mean? Whose concerns does it reflect? What interests does it further? To assume that the social relations of class, gender, race, sexuality, ability, etc., that shape the larger society are not reproduced in the movement to democratize media is simply not a helpful assumption. How do these social relations get reproduced in this movement? And what are the measures, apart from good intentions, that we can implement to enable the transformation of these power relations within this incredibly vibrant, creative, and politically very important global movement? Other questions: how different is the alternate media promoted by media democracy movement activists from the mainstream media in its foundational assumptions? Certainly alternate media is very, very complex, and I don't mean to suggest that it is one thing. The media democratization movement is also very, very complex, and it represents many different perspectives and many different views. So I'm not suggesting that all of these alternate media or media democratization activists all are just one kind of monolithic group or have one monolithic perspective. Certainly there are elites in this movement as well, in this media as well. And I don't mean to underscore the importance, as I've said already, of creating this space. But what I do want to do is look very seriously at some key issues and see whether and how the assumptions and perspectives and politics that shape mainstream media coverage may converge or diverge from those that inform alternate media. My focus here will be Western or Eurocentric worldviews, which dominate, I would argue, both the mainstream media and the alternate media, which further, both implicitly and explicitly, racialize domination of the socio-political order at the global level. And what I want to look at here is the role of Islamophobia and the coverage that we see of Muslims, Muslim men and Muslim women.